Another aspect of the view of Christ that we were talking about earlier is that this divine being, the Christ, came to represent to us the human archetype. So humans had fallen away. It had been hard for them to manifest or understand or be conscious of their own archetype, their own meaning, like a word that lost its meaning and was unable to speak its true meaning. And so Christ came into the sense perceptible body of a human being so that humans could perceive again the archetype of what they were supposed to be. And yeah, so as you say, that was another thing that I was trying to imagine in these stories was what was it like for that person with their particular condition to be in the presence of this archetype, and how did that then shift something for them?
Welcome to the Spiritual Forum, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. It is a beautiful 75-degree day in Wisconsin, which is unusual for March. But, it'll go back to snowing next week. It's just the way it is during spring. I want to thank everybody for supporting this podcast, which is a voice of hope, inspiration, awakening. I've got information on my website, thespiritualforum.org, about my retreat. So just /retreat. And that is going to be held this October. So if you want to learn more about that, check that out. And also, if you want to receive my weekly newsletter, which highlights my most recent podcast, my reflections about it, a segment from a prior podcast and a thought for the day kind of thing, you can do so on my website, thespiritualforum.org, and be a part of the community in that way. Now, let me introduce you to my guest. Her name is Lory Widmer Hess. And she grew up near Seattle, and she now lives in Switzerland. So she's, 5 or 6 hours ahead of me. And she currently works there with adults and with developmental challenges, and she practices spiritual direction. Since childhood, she's been on a quest for both personal healing and for integrative spiritual wisdom, which led her to pursue esoteric studies along with practical life experiences. And that's really right up the alley of this podcast. I think most people here are pursuing personal healing and wisdom and spirituality in a practical way. So Lory is a longtime student of Anthroposophy, and her writing has been published widely in multiple journals and magazines, and I will have all of that listed in her bio. She just recently published her first book, which is called When Fragments Make a Whole, a personal journey through healing stories in the Bible. It was published last year, and we're going to be centering our conversation on that. Welcome, Lory.
Thank you so much.
I'm very excited to talk with you today, particularly about how you dug into the healing stories in the Bible. I've also received so much personal inspiration and wisdom from the healing stories, but you went into all of them, and I think there were like 18.
Mhm.
And so that's really, really exciting to really dig into what they all mean. But let's start off with just a few rapid fire questions so we can kind of get to know you in a personal way. And you're okay with that? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll just have 3. I always like this one. Do you have any kind of word or phrase that you live your life by or that you use a lot in your life?
Well, a word that I use in my centering prayer practice is amen. So be it. So I would say that is something I try to live by. Let it be in a, calming, centering kind
Oh.
of way.
Very interesting. I think most people think amen just means this prayer is finished.
Mm. Mhm.
And they don't really understand what it really means.
Mhm.
I'm surrendering this prayer. I'm giving it up, and it is done. Kind of thing.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
I love that.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have any favorite place? It could be geographical. It could be a place you've traveled. It could be some place in your house. Whatever. Do you have a favorite place?
Well, I do love the mountains here in Switzerland. So before we moved here, we visited regularly. My husband is Swiss, so we would go on trips um, while we still lived in the States. And I just found them very special. And now that we live here, we get to visit them quite often.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
I mean, that's amazing. I didn't think about you're in a place of so much beauty.
it is.
And I mean, the Swiss Alps is like a vacation dream for most people.
Hmm.
And there you are living right there. How wonderful. Okay, the last question is who is a person in your life, either past or present, or deceased or a fictional character, somebody who has influenced you in a significant way?
Oh, wow, that's hard because there's so many. I could think of so many influences. But as a story or a fictional character, I would say Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. Because as I was thinking about my spiritual story, I thought, and specifically the movie of the Wizard of Oz. I watched that movie over and over when I was a child. It was actually like a religion for me. And her trajectory, wanting to get away from home, being whisked into this magical land of color and excitement and friendship, but then realizing she wanted to get back to her home that she thought she had wanted to leave. And then in the end, realizing these places are the same. These are the same place, the same people, actually. Um, that, yeah, has always stuck with me.
That's so interesting. Again, I think that a lot of people think that's especially if you watch it when you're really young, it's there's some scary stuff in it, and it's also it kind of creeps people out. And some people have bad memories of it, and I revisited it as an adult, and it's like, wow, it's a spiritual story. It's
It
really
is.
a hero's journey,
Mhm.
and when you look at it from a spiritual lens, there's so much to absorb from it and to learn, and ultimately I just love that ultimately the wizard is kind of a fate, and we really have to rely on our own, intuition, our own sense, and our own
Yeah,
direction within
yeah.
us. Yeah. Really, really great story. Thanks for that.
Mhm.
Okay. That was fun. So normally I do ask my guests to just jump into like, what's their spiritual story? Your book really is pretty much your spiritual story. But I thought it might be interesting to share with listeners right off the bat, set the stage for anthropos, anthroposophy.
That's right.
I
Very
did
good.
it. I did it. There's just so many letters there. Anthroposophy, which was founded by Rudolf Steiner. And I shared before we started recording, I hadn't found Rudolf Steiner until the last few years of my life. I wish I'd known more about him. But I thought it might be good if you give us a little background on that, because as we go through and talk about, the healings and your own stories that relate to those healings, you really have an interesting and a different and very deep way of looking at Christ and what that means.
Mhm.
And so, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, well, I'll do my best. It's an immense topic, but in to give just a very brief orientation, Rudolf Steiner lived 100 years ago. This is actually the 100th anniversary of his death. There's lots of celebrations and, yeah, commemorations around that. So he died 100 years ago. And ha in his life was a spiritual teacher, uh, what he called a spiritual researcher, um, clairvoyant, who shared his researches, but also very much wanted to give a path that was appropriate for modern people to undertake in order themselves also to come to spiritual insight in a way that was in line with our consciousness today. not ancient, older, dreamy kind of consciousness, but an awake consciousness that was what he called actually a spiritual science. So the science of the spirit, that one brings this thinking capacity and can use that objectivity, clarity, logic to do spiritual research, and out of that bring insights into the world that are vital for our world today, are so needed. So he just, his output was amazing, incredible. He didn't write that many books, I think around 20 or so, but he gave thousands of lectures, which were recorded and have been collected, and on just all kinds of things. His insights inspired initiatives in education, agriculture, religion, religious renewal, new form of the sacraments for today, many other fields. And so I encountered this work through, as many people do, through an interest in Waldorf education, which is the education that is inspired by Steiner's work. I was interested in that, and that's how I got into learning about anthroposophy. And I was 26 years old at the time. It was about the middle of my life so far. And it really changed my life. And it became something that I continue to learn from and with and through, and puzzle through, and just, yeah, but can't imagine my own understanding without it at this point.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting that he was born in, what, 1860
1860
something? I can't remember.
yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Anyway, he's a contemporary of Charles Fillmore, who founded Unity, and also other things were going on at that time, around the turn of the 20th century. So much was going on about spirituality and enlightenment, and, Emerson and Thoreau was doing their thing, and we had the religious science people, all sorts of new ways of taking traditional Christianity, Christian ideas, and making them very relevant for people, modern people, and connecting them with science and our mind and all of that. I just think it's fascinating that there are people in different parts of the world that were all around the same time coming up with these really interesting new breakthrough ideas.
Mhm.
And Rudolf Steiner was he German? What was he?
Yeah, he was German heritage. Where he was born was actually part of what is now Yugoslavia, but it was then
Okay,
the
okay.
Austro-Hungarian Empire at the
Yeah,
time. Mhm.
yeah. So, before we get into your book and the healings of Jesus, I read your appendix, and if I remember this correctly, I think the idea is that uh, Jesus, the man, became the Christ, or the God man, or the God infused spiritual man at the time of his baptism in the river by John the Baptist.
Mhm.
That's when whether it's actual or whether it's metaphorical, I've been trained to look at the Bible kind of or allegorically, but it could have actually happened, where the skies kind of opened and the dove came down, and it was, you are my beloved son. So there's lot of drama that happened
Mhm.
there,
Mhm.
which I think could represent, that the spirit of the Christ is entering you now,
Mhm.
which I think is really interesting compared to the traditional belief that the little baby was, born as God in a baby's body.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes. Yeah, there is a difference there. So there's a whole complicated, which I didn't even try to go into in this appendix. What Steiner brings out of his research into the background of the Gospels is a very complicated story of the Jesus child, and there's actually two. So it's clear if you read the four Gospels, there's two completely different stories in Matthew and Luke. He explains how these come together into the adult Jesus, man named Jesus at age 30. And then at that point, at the time of the baptism in the Jordan, the kind of human individuality of this man, Jesus, sacrifices, in a way, gives over this place in this body, the sheaths of this body, so that the Christ being, who was a spiritual being, can come in and then live in this body for 3 years, only for 3 years.
I think that's so interesting. Yeah, I think that's so interesting. I really like engaging with different ideas because we don't really absolutely know the truth. So this is a really interesting idea. So I was really glad to be introduced to it because I think it gives us a really interesting background or backdrop to how you look at Christ and Jesus and the healings.
Right.
And so your book is so interesting to me because it walks through each of the healings that are in the Gospels, and you explore the story through poetry, through kind of your own imagined understanding of what was going on with this character and and how they were in the condition they were in and what happened when they experienced their healing. And then you talk about it, each healing, like what it really meant, and then you go into your own personal experience, which mirrors or matches in some way that healing. So this is what I love so much about what you've done, because I think people just look at all those healings and they kind of become a jumble. Like, he healed a lot of people. All right. You healed this, you healed that. But you've made a lot of sense out of it in terms of what each healing represents. I think we would do the same thing in Unity. We look at what it metaphysically represents, and then how does this apply to my life? And so I thought that was just so really interesting what you did in your book. So before we get into that, there also seems to be, I think, a purpose to the order of the healings in the Gospels. Is that what you found?
That's what I felt. Yeah, that it was also in relation to other events in the Gospels, like the crossing of the sea, the transfiguration, the feeding of the 5,000. It was really something that started, for example, closer to home, or to what Jesus at that time had as his home place of Capernaum. Started there with several healings, but then started to go further afield. Different kinds of healings came into play. The sensory healings, for example, of the blind and the deaf don't occur at the beginning. They occur later on. To compare the four Gospels was also very interesting because they each have a very different structure, specifically with regard to the healings. They each have different contents and they're in a different order. And I didn't go into an extensive study of each one, but I sort of collated them, put them together. And yeah, that order seemed significant to me. And when I applied it to my life, it was my idea to bring in my life story. It was interesting that it went quite smoothly, like that. I didn't have to mess with the chronology or anything. The events in my life seemed to also follow this order in a way. So
that was really fascinating because you didn't like have a healing and then talk about what happened to you in 1992, and another one talk about what happened to you in 2015. It was a chronology of your life, which makes me wonder if we each have that pattern or not. So let's talk a little bit about that. And I think normally, like I say, I start with asking you to tell your spiritual story. So perhaps you can share a little bit about your healing journey and how different points really applied to the different healing stories of Jesus and the Gospels. So I know that's what your whole book is, but perhaps you can kind of share a briefer chronology.
Try to give an overview. Yeah. Well, in the book, I start I explain first kind of in my introduction a little bit about me before the age of 21. But the first story I relate my healing journey to is at the time when I was 21 years old and senior in college. And I outwardly was coping, doing well in school, getting ready to graduate, go on to next stage in life. But inwardly, I felt there was something wrong that I would describe as a kind of inner split. And I had a disturbing experience of feeling distance from my body, not in my body. And that scared me. And I had actually a fear of being evil or being psychotic, or I just had all these fears and no one to talk to. And it was, yeah, felt like I had no one to talk to. I have to say, it's probably not that that nobody would have understood or listened to me, but I had this inner restriction that kept me from getting help at that time. So that was kind of my spiritual condition at that time. Wasn't getting, wasn't feeling like I got what I needed from conventional church, much though I appreciated and loved the Episcopal tradition that I grew up in, a liturgical tradition, the music, the stories. I loved that, but it didn't address this issue in me. So that partly was what sent me on a kind of journey or searching to find what could address this and what could also answer some of my spiritual and religious questions that I also didn't find answered in mainstream Christianity. And before too many years had passed, I had this encounter with Anthroposophy, began studying it, began finding in it some of what I had been looking for. And before healing really became more sick or more overtly sick, what had been in me came out more and became more visible. I was doing a movement training called Eurythmy, which is another one of these initiatives out of Steiner's insights, which is about bringing the movement actually of what is normally experienced in the soul out into physical visibility. And so pretty naturally, the kind of dysfunction I had in my soul was coming out and becoming visible. But again, I was having a hard time talking about it, finding help, being able to articulate, being very confused, and yeah, it was a hard time then. Then there were steps into life in terms of getting married, having a child, still having many of these issues still churning around inside of me, but making that step further into the practical tasks in life, as you mentioned in your intro to me, which turned out to be very, very important, difficult also in many ways. I'm not a natural housekeeper or having a newborn was very hard, and I struggled with postpartum depression, and just having these demands on me suddenly was rough at the beginning, but we all survived and sort of went forward, and I know that also was changing me and working on me in a way that was also related to my spiritual life, to my moral life, because what was happening was I had to be responsible for people and for my relationship with them in a way I hadn't been before, just alone in my independent single life. So it brought very difficult things. It brought gifts, but these gifts and working through the difficulties didn't really come to pass until I then had the experience of working with adults with developmental challenges, which my husband and I first did together. We ran a house together, and that wasn't something I had background in or knowledge of. He did. So I kind of rode along with him at that time. And yeah, was just along for the ride. But it ended up being a very transformative experience for me, because all of these habits that I had of hiding and being afraid to share what was going on in me and being scared of being judged. And for them, they didn't do that. So they don't hide. They don't pretend. They don't try to live on their own. They don't isolate themselves. And they have no masks. They have no filters. So they're also very vulnerable. And they have to live out of trust. They have to trust that they will be cared for. And we then have to step up, ideally, hopefully, to the task. We always fall short, but it was a chance then to experience this way of being, which is very different from my ordinary way of being, but which over time I could sense this is the truly human way to be. This is the way. This is the healthy way. Kind of ironic, because from the world's point of view, the people I was working with were not healthy. There was something wrong with them from the so-called normal point of view. But to me, I began to feel we all have that underneath, but we're just better at hiding it. We have this intellectual part of us where we can put up these masks and these filters, but it doesn't do away with what's underneath, what's below the surface. So that was a very central, I would say, again, a spiritual journey, getting behind what appears to be the surface reality, what is really going on, and experiencing, again, a model of what I would say it is to live in an honest, truthful, moral way. So it was like graduate school for me. It was like going from kindergarten to graduate school in
So
a few
interesting.
years.
Yeah, let's pause for just a second, because you started off by saying when you were in your early 20s that you felt an inner split. And I do think that we're all split, and we're all split in some way. Like you just described the adults with developmental disabilities. They're not split. They're just kind of like, here I am.
Yeah.
All the rest of us have some masks or something that we're hiding or something we don't know, aspects of our character that's in our shadow, ways that we disconnect from our bodies, and that we present ourselves one way here and another way there. And so I think that that's something that we all, when we kind of wake up to what's really going on with us, that is something that we are here to heal. And then you found in the Jesus healings some stories that
Right.
helped mirror what that is, even though the stories back then might have been about demons or whatever. But the way that people in those stories healed their split, or what was happening to them.
Yes.
So I want to talk about that in next, but I don't want to lose this idea that the inner condition, what's going on in you, what was going on in you, what's going on in me, and what's going on within all of us, whether we're experiencing this split or turmoil, or we can't share ourselves, or we're too connected to the material world, whatever it is, that does manifest in the physical body as symptoms or as
It did
issues.
for me. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it does for most of us. It may be separated by time, but the body kind of is going to. There's only so much of a mask that you can wear, and the body's going to ultimately, when we have symptoms in some place, some aspect of our body, that traditional allopathic medicine tells us to go get a medicine or a treatment or a surgery.
Right.
But another way of looking is to go inside and look at why is this manifesting within me and what needs to be healed within.
Right. Yeah. So actually, that was kind of the question with which I approached each of the healing stories then. So here is this outer symptom, whether it's leprosy or a withered hand or being bent over or blindness, etc. And the question for me was, well, what was this is the outer appearance and what's going on inside of that person? What does it feel like to be like this? What might have happened in their life before? What was it like before they had this condition? What were they doing before that? And how did their life change after? So yeah, kind of filling in the inner story at which had to, for me, it had to be then the inner counterpart of the outer condition.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that your poetry that went into that inner world of each of the characters was so interesting. I read, I don't know, maybe 3/4 of the stories. I've got to go back and read the rest, but I was really surprised by the ones that really moved me.
Mm-hmm.
Because, of course, Lazarus is so dramatic and things like that, but the withered hand, the man with the withered hand
Mm-hmm.
really moved me, and the meditation that you left people with was stretch out your hand.
Mm-hmm.
And, to me, it was like, okay, like, what is a withered hand? Like, I can't identify with that. I don't have a withered hand, my hands are fine.
Mm.
So, it's easy to look at a story like that and go, well, Jesus was helping this one man who has a withered hand. But then with that kind of command, stretch out your hand. I mean, that's like, that like calls me to move,
Mm-hmm.
you know, m- move in some way that was small, withered, not really in performing to its potential, and to stretch out my hand to, the Christ. And it really moved me because it made me look at where do I need to stretch, and reach out. I think that's just one example of the healings that can, when you really look at it, you can really go deep into your world and your life and go,
Mm-hmm.
okay,
Mm-hmm.
this is my story too.
Yeah. Yeah. Wonderful. And I have to say, each of the healings, they're all me. They're all me
Right.
also. I mean, I imagined a different backstory for each one, but I have all of these things. I had to relate to it in order to write it, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, we each are the character.
Mm-hmm.
So, the characters that are being healed, that's us. That's me. I'm, placing myself into the story. And then, my spiritual journey or path is to look at how am I showing up in that story and how does this apply to me? So like another one that really moved me is the centurion's servant or the centurion's son, because this is a person who had so much faith that was like, no, he doesn't have to come here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, like, wow, it's like, most of us want to see all this. Like, you prove it.
Mm-hmm.
And the centurion was like, my son or my servant is ill. And I think that we presume it might have been a son. I love the story that you
Mm.
told in your poetry. But to have that much faith to say, well, like I'm not really worthy for him to come into my home, but I have complete faith that this healing is happening.
Yeah.
And talk about stretching out your hand. That's a real stretch in faith.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, another interesting thing to look at, or what really came home to me going through this sequence, was how Jesus relates differently to each person. He doesn't have a kind of healing formula that he applies every time. Sometimes he touches the person, sometimes he just says words, sometimes he doesn't say anything. And sometimes it's the person who does something or says something. And sometimes there's a community. Sometimes there's other people involved. It's not always only Jesus by himself. So that is very interesting to look at and experience all these different ways actually of relating to the healer. And what I would say, it's my point of view that what the healer does is not apply a magic wand and fix people. He activates healing forces in the person themselves. And that's said in several stories. Your faith has healed you. He's there to, by his presence, by his actions, by his words, bring something into movement or into life or into activity that in that person was having a hard time coming into its right place.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like he didn't heal people. You know, it's like people have it in, we have it in ourselves. We're equipped, from my standpoint, we're equipped as divinely created beings. Our bodies are not our enemies.
Mhm.
We have a healing nature. When something invades the body, our bodies are completely conditioned to purge it and to bring us back, to restore us back to
Yeah.
health. And so illness is not a natural condition of life. And we have the power within us to heal ourselves. Now that I think what happens is people look at this is a historical, or it's a story, or it's a fairy tale,
Mhm.
and that was great for them. But now we're in this modern
Yeah.
world, and this thing just happened to me, and I have cancer, and I can't do anything about it because it's just kind of been normalized. But I believe we do have the capability to heal, and what was happened, I think, for those people is the Christ energy. I mean, Jesus as the Christ is like, I mean, there must have been something just absolutely amazing about being in that presence, that suddenly I saw so much possibility for myself,
Mhm.
or I recognize that the dimension that I thought I was stuck in is much bigger than I thought. And I have so much ability. It really is just my saying yes to it,
Mhm.
or being willing.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's not really stuck in this guy 2,000 years ago, but it, it's here for us now.
Mhm. Mhm. Right. I mean, another aspect of the view of Christ that we were talking about earlier is that this divine being, the Christ, came to represent to us the human archetype. So humans had fallen away. It had been hard for them to manifest or understand or be conscious of their own archetype, their own meaning, like a word that lost its meaning and was unable to speak its true meaning. And so Christ came into the sense perceptible body of a human being so that humans could perceive again the archetype of what they were supposed to be. And yeah, so as you say, that was another thing that I was trying to imagine in these stories was what was it like for that person with their particular condition to be in the presence of this archetype, and how did that then shift something for them? How did it help them come through that condition?
Yeah, and your poetry is beautiful. I mean, it really is, and it really opened my heart to see each of these healing stories in a completely different way. It's almost like you created a movie, but better than that, because you created the inner world
Mm,
of a character, of a person, and like what could they be feeling?
yeah.
And I mean, I feel like that was kind of a divine gift. I don't know how that came to you or not. Very intuitive, I would guess, but the way you retell the story from the perspective of the person who was healed, I think was just really amazing.
Well, it was, yeah, divine gift is a good way to put it. I wrote these poems at a point in my life when I was having a very difficult time. It was during the time when my husband and I were working, running this this house for the developmentally challenged people, and the two of us were going through a crisis. So things we hadn't dealt with in ourselves and with each other, between each other, were coming out in this atmosphere where people let down their masks and are honest and real. It was kind of like we either had to do that ourselves or something was going to crash. And so that was a very hard time, during which that was when the ideas to study these stories came to me. I just wanted to study them as a kind of help, a resource, meditation. And the poems just started to come. So with the first stories I did that with, I just had the impulse to write one of these poems from their point of view as kind of way of getting into it more, answering some of my own questions for myself. And it was a creative impulse that came very strongly in a way that I hadn't felt for many, many years. I had actually not written creatively for years. But at this time, this writing impulse came to me and felt like a gift from creation itself that was helping me to get through this time when everything in my life seemed to be falling apart. So I'm looking at these stories of resurrection and life and feeling like my life, my marriage is dying. Like I was going through a death. And I don't know what I would have done if a kind of creative impulse like that had not been there for me. It was a very essential kind of counter impulse to everything else that was going on. So yeah, they were a gift to me. Of course, they were also, in a sense, my creation. They're out of my imagination, my understanding, my pictures that I have, things I've read, all of that played into it. My own life, as I said, I am also each one of these people, and so my experiences come into it. But at the same time, there was something that was not just me, that also could speak to me through the voice of this person. And I can't claim that what I said, the backstory I invented, is true. But on the other hand, for me, it made sense and it felt true. And so there was a kind of reality about it that was also very supportive, confirming.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think like it has to be actually true. You've created some. I mean, like I could see this as a movie. I could see going from character to character and their like inner world kind of coming alive. But anyway, I love the way you imagine the people and what they were feeling and what their conditions are and how they got in that place and all that. So I think it really added a lot. Oh, the story that I've probably told most as a minister back when I was leading a church was the Pool of Bethesda. That's one that's been in my toolbox a lot because I really liked. I mean, I think your thoughts about it were, do you have the will to be healed as your final meditation? But I love the way Jesus talked to this person. Okay, this is a backdrop for people who don't know the story. That there's a guy who's been sitting there for many years, right? How many years?
38 years.
38 years, yeah. Waiting to get his body into this pool when the waters kind of shake, when the angels shake the waters or something like that. And so just the idea of, how many people are waiting for something, to get some kind of magical place in order for something to be fixed for them, or waiting for somebody else to take them there, waiting for some sort of miracle versus doing something on their own. And Jesus responded with, pick up your mat and walk. And I always thought that was really inspiring, that it really takes our own agency, to say yes to a new dimension of life rather than sitting back for years and years and years and not really stepping up to what's possible for us.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and my efforts are just probably scratching the surface of what is in there. But what came to me was, yes, there is that at the end, that he takes the agency of standing up, healing himself in a way, as we were talking about. But before that, he has to answer this question
Yeah.
of Christ. Do you have the will to be healed, or do you want to be healed? Some translate it. And his answer is really interesting because he says, I didn't have anyone to put me in the water. And some people think that's not answering the question. But to me, this was the whole crux of the story that actually inspired my version, was that it seemed to me, well, he's admitting that he needs help. He's admitting he couldn't do it by himself, that he needs someone. Well, what happened? What was then the trajectory before that? And what I imagined was somebody who couldn't admit that they needed help and that they helped everyone else. And that was,
yeah, that's right. That's right.
yeah. And that then for him to come, and then even after he was paralyzed, he couldn't admit that he needed help. But that then in this moment, this encounter with Christ, he could finally admit it. But then he could stand up and do it himself, and didn't have to wait for someone else to help him. But somehow going through the needle's eye of that admission, which can be so difficult for many people, including me, that was the impetus for healing.
See, this is a really good example about these stories and how we can find themselves in them. And so I look at it from a different angle because of stuff that goes on inside my world. You look at it from this angle because of stuff that's going on inside your world. And the story still holds and is very powerful with two completely different perspectives.
Yeah. Everyone would write differently about all of these stories.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And this is what I really thought was so interesting about what you did with your book, is because you created the inner world of the characters, and you talked about what it meant at the time, and then you apply it to your own life. And I could see, like, after that chapter being a how do you apply it to your life, a little workbook, for people to look at it, okay, because my life's different than yours.
Right.
When I read about your life, there were some things, aspects of it, I could go, oh, that's familiar, that's familiar, that's familiar, that's familiar, and that's familiar. That's not familiar, that, so, we each have completely different stuff that we're having to heal. And so we can, I think we can each look at these stories and go inside, read your poetry. Perhaps we have another idea about who this character is. And then how does this calling to me personally? So I just love what you did. And I really want to dig into it more myself. So you've really kind of inspired me to do that.
Well, I so much encourage that and hope for that. I really, that would be the best result I could hope for from reading this book. It's not that people go away from it and think, oh, wow, how impressive imagination, but that it's then, oh, I could do this too. I could look at these stories or other stories, take other gospel stories or other stories.
Yeah.
It can be from other spiritual traditions or anything that is inspiring to you, and do this too. And but especially to take these particular healing stories, I would think it would be fantastic to see all kinds of different versions.
Yeah, and like a book study or something, having a group kind of work through this, individually and with a group.
Yeah.
So you did touch on your experience with the adults with developmental challenges. I thought that was so interesting. Do you feel that was also kind of divinely inspired, that you found yourself in this situation with these people who would normally be kind of like in the Bible, more like the cast-offs, and then here you're immersed in them with them.
Yeah.
And then they're your teacher.
Absolutely. It was a gift. And, these gifts we bring that come to us in life, we don't have to take them up. That I can also look back and see many things that should have been gifts that I didn't fully unwrap. But this time, for some reason, and it took some time, I was there for 6 years. It wouldn't have like 1 year wouldn't have been enough. But it became absolutely a gift that came to me through destiny. It would not have happened if I hadn't married this particular person. Probably wouldn't have happened if we didn't have a child, because we went there partly because we thought it would be a good environment for raising him. And yeah, so all things come together that you think don't have anything to do with each other, or chance or coincidence. But then sometimes you can see the meaning and see the purpose through them and think, yeah, this was needed for my healing and my development. And I'm so thankful.
It's so interesting because I think life is really like it presents so many forks in the road and places we can go. And then we have the will, we have the free will to choose left or right
Mhm.
or forward or backward or up or down or whatever. And then if we surrender to the choice, like this is where I've stepped in this direction. Now I'm walking this path. And when we surrender to that, like we're not like focusing on, well, maybe I should have gone here
Mhm.
or maybe I shouldn't be here.
Mhm.
In that act of surrender, then the gifts start showing up, I think.
Yes.
And then it's up to us to accept the gifts and to see the lesson and how I can grow here versus fight against it or be split thinking I should be over here instead.
Mhm. Yeah, I came to feel like I've had points of that in my life where, oh, I should have done this instead. And sometimes I could see, yeah, there would have been maybe a good thing might have come about if I had done that. But if I keep going down this road, which initially might feel like the wrong fork, then I will get something even better. It's kind of like
Yeah.
you make the wrong choice, but then if you stay with it and, as you say, surrender to it or open to it, it's my experience and my belief that divine wisdom doesn't punish us for our mistakes, but they actually will give us more and better and more than we can even imagine. But we have to stay with it. We have to get to that point.
Yeah, but we have to stay on the healing journey because as you brought up, all of those healing stories, there's an arc to it. It didn't stop at, the casting out
Yeah.
the evil spirit or didn't start at the lepers or stop at the lepers. There's a whole arc there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that we're all here to go through all of these different healings as it applies to our life. Um, and then I think the other thing that kind of came to me is that the people in our lives that we've chosen to surround ourselves with, because you're very, very, very open about the challenges in your marriage and how you've evolved in your marriage and how, I shared with you before we record, I wasn't sure, where things were going to end up. But these people who we've chosen to be in our lives are also part of our healing.
Mhm. Mhm. Yep, absolutely. I'm so thankful for that and for their willingness to stay with me and be with me through all of this.
Well, and you also
And
were
likewise,
part
it's
of their healing
mutual.
journey.
It's mutual.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right, right. Okay. Well, Laura, do you have anything that you want to share that we did not cover before we close out today?
I don't think so, unless you feel like there's anything you wanted to ask, or whether we covered the things you were hoping to kind of touch
I
on this
think,
time.
I feel pretty complete. I I really do like looking at the gospel stories and looking at all of the characters and who am I? I always taught that as a minister, these may be historical characters, they may be stories, but the real lesson is
Mhm.
in placing myself in that
Right.
situation.
Well,
And
I would like to add something to that,
okay.
which is to say, so this idea of placing yourself in the story, of meditating on the story in a kind of contemplative way, and then in a personal way, a prayerful way, this is not something I just came up with.
Right.
There's a method of praying with scripture called Lectio Divina, which is a ancient monastic practice, and it's having a kind of revival today. So you can read books about it, you can have workshops, there's resources to work with that. And that's basically actually the pattern of the book. So even though nobody maybe has produced a book in exactly this form, that pattern of reflecting on this, taking in the story, reflecting on it, applying it to your life, bringing in a prayerful, a prayer at the end. That is Lectio Divina. So not my brilliant idea. And then the practice of actually imagining yourself into a Bible story is very much part of the tradition of the Ignatian stream. So the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius. And that is something that I actually, and that's basically what I was doing when I wrote the poems. But I didn't even know that it was an Ignatian practice until after I had done all of that writing. However, after I had done it myself and then learned that it was part of this tradition, I could see why it is so powerful to do that. But again, if you're interested in that, you can, again, look into Ignatian imaginative prayer, I think it is called, and that there's resources for that as well.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't know that that term either. I mean, I learned this. I can't remember what they called it. When I was in seminary, I learned about this process of, I can't remember, there was another name for it, but it sounds like it's rooted in this. But that's where the light, the gold, the prize is in learning about ourselves through the stories. And there's so much more to learn. So, well, I really appreciate the work that you've done. I appreciate your authentic, raw sharing in your book about your life. And, I think that your challenges in life are very relatable. They're not like absolutely, horrifically dramatic. They're
Right.
challenges with relationships and finding your voice and learning who you are and marriage and children and these kinds of things that most everyone can relate to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Lory, so much for your contribution to the world, for sharing yourself so authentically, and for putting together this really, really interesting way of looking at these healing stories, which I think are so important for all of us because we're all here to heal.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for coming on. And everybody, thank you for listening. And I now close the Spiritual Forum.